Okay. Hello, everybody. Today, our guest speaker is Massimo Durante. Thank you very much for joining us, Massimo. And the seminar and Durante talk is about a relevant topic, I think, in web society and contemporary society. The title of the seminar and also of the book published by Routledge is Computational Power, the Impact of ICT on Law, Society, and Knowledge. Massimo Durante is professor in philosophy of law and legal informatics at the University of Turin in Italy. He is coordinator of a Turin unit of research for the Law, Science and Technology Joint Doctorate, Rights of the Internet of Everything. And his current research concerns issues of law and technology and digital governance from a legal, ethical, and epistemological perspective. Massimo, you have 40 minutes to present your work and to give an introduction of your book. And so the stage is yours. Then we will open the floor for question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you. Thank you very much for the center for inviting me, for giving the possibility to talk a little bit about my book. That's a very great pleasure and honor to be here and to discuss with all of you. So let me share the screen so I can present some slides about the topic of today. Hope you can see the presentation. Can you see it?
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
yes,
good,
yes,
very good. So I cannot see myself, but that's not a problem. So I will try to introduce the main topics of my book, and then I hope there will be time to have a discussion. That's the most interesting part for me to discuss with all of you. Just to set the stage of the discussion, let me say something about the book. So that's the general outline of my presentation. Let me say something about the genesis of the book, and then I want to concentrate, to focus on what has been called the impact of digital ICT regarding to at least three main topics, that is to say law, society, and knowledge. So here is the book, and as you can see, this is the index of the book. In the book, I touched to many different topics, and of course, there will be no time to focus on each of them. And so I will just present you some reflection and some underlying theses that are behind the book. And the book was originally written in Italian because of one professor that is director of a series on philosophy of science asked me to write a book on the epistemological impacts of ICT. And so I decided to take the possibility to make a reasoning on a regional epistemology that is law, and then to widen this reflection and to extend to the impact that ICT have on society and knowledge. And then the book has been translated into English and published for Routledge in a series that is called Antinomies. So maybe in the discussion we can come back to some of the specific points, but I will not deal with them here in the presentation. So let me start for the general impact of digital ICT. First of all, the idea is that individual and collective well-being depends increasingly on the impact of digital ICT. Whatever digital ICT might be, that is to say computational system, mainly artificial intelligence or machine learning, or all the other emergent digital technologies that can be subsumed under the notion of computational system.
Sorry, Massimo.
Yeah.
I'm seeing the first slide, the title.
Yeah.
Maybe
don't you see? Do you see the current slide?
No,
or just the
just the first, the title.
Okay, so I don't know why. Because I see correctly the slide.
Sometimes Zoom doesn't want full screen.
No idea how to manage this. If you want, I can get out and come back. And
sometimes Zoom doesn't work well with full screen.
So what can I do? I can.
I'm not sure. From our end. Now
okay,
it's moved.
Now you can see?
Yeah.
Oh, because the full screen. Okay,
now it's
so
okay.
It's okay? It's fine? Good.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry. No problem at all. So I was saying one of the starting consideration of the book is what has been called the digital dependence. So the idea that individual and collective well-being increasingly depends on the impact of digital ICT. And as you know, the map of our dependencies traces the map of our opportunities and strength, but also at the same time, the map of our weaknesses. So this idea of dependence could be also discussed a little bit afterwards. So the starting point was that I could not consider law as the only subject of my investigation, because traditionally there have always been spheres of intersection between knowledge, law, and society. And nowadays I had to consider these spheres of intersection as shaped by the impact of ICT. Law has always developed its own epistemology, its own way of representing the reality. So that's the reason why I consider the interaction between law, knowledge, and society. And sorry. So to go on, okay. So the other phenomenon is that we deal with digital ICT. We need to take into consideration the technological convergence between data, digital platforms, and computational power. So each of them, of course, could be a different topic of discussion. But nowadays, we need to consider that the impact of ICT mainly depends on the convergence between these different aspects of digitization. And of course, we could consider even more the IPC, high computing performance, computational data analytics, and so on. But mainly, these are the three main aspects of technological convergence. So the other phenomenon that I took into consideration is that increasingly we delegate decision and task to computational systems that are more and more autonomous. Of course, here autonomous is not taken into a philosophical meaning, but first of all into the computer science meaning, where autonomy means the capability of a computational system to change its internal state without being affected by an external stimulus in such a way as to be able to choose between alternatives. So it is of course different from the meaning that we attach philosophically to human autonomy, but still it raises many different problems that lead me to consider that we do not have to focus too much on the idea of artificial intelligence, which is a kind of erroneous way to tackle the problem of artificial dimension of computational system. And so I rename this issue in terms of artificial agency. And I do believe that in the next future, we will start consider more and more closely the problem of artificial agency instead of artificial intelligence, or so to speak, the so-called weak artificial intelligence we lead and we dealt with in terms of artificial agency. So if we consider law, for instance, digitization has a strong impact on law and changes our conceptual tools, the way in which our conceptual tools in the fields of law interact with each other, also who holds these conceptual tools, and it changed also the backdrop against which one we look at this conceptual tool. So there is a very big impact of digitization on the field of law. I don't want to be too much technical because this is a part maybe you are not so much interested in, but of course there is a big impact for us legal scholars on our own fields. And so the idea is that digitization creates new legal notions, new legal source of law, new legal subjects and objects. So it has a very deep impact and oblige us to reconsider the traditional way in which we look at the phenomenon of the social phenomenon of law. So for instance, this is an old story that has been characterized at least the last 15 years, 10, 15, maybe 20 years. And so, for instance, one of the first dealing with the impact of technology and digital technology on law has been Lawrence Lessig, who wrote this book by saying that code is law. Code here is means the software code, that is to say, digital technology. So what is important in Lawrence Lessig approach, it is the idea that there is a competition between different normative systems. So here we are with the first thesis of my book, and the general idea is that law has always competes with other normative systems, and nowadays there is a very big and strong competition between law and technology as normative system that claims to regulate our own behavior and society, and to some extent, as we will see, our own life. So as you can see, for instance, Lawrence Lessig was making reference to law, code, economy, social norms, but we could add, of course, ethics, culture, religion as normative system. And here the idea is that to some extent, AI or computational system, they are normative system, specific forms of normative system. Of course, every normative system employs a different conception of norms, a different conception of how norms are applied and enforced, and how the evaluation of social behavior is done. So every normative system has its particular and specific standing. But AI, the artificial agency of computational system, they raise a sort of competitive stance with a more traditional normative system. That's one of the main features of the impact of ICT on law. And according to this, let me come back. When we consider a social phenomenon nowadays that we want to regulate in the law field, we cannot consider only law as the normative system. We need to consider the interplay between different normative systems. And as you can imagine, a normative system can reinforce another normative system, but can also contrast or supplant another normative system. So there is an internal struggle between competition between this normative system. There is another important point about the impact of ICT on law that has been remarked by different scholars, and that is very important in my book as well. We move from a traditional dyadic model of governance that takes into consideration public actors, which could be states or supranational entities, and individuals, who traditionally are mainly concerned as citizens. In this model of governance, we are used to consider top-down regulation, that is to say that the state or public supranational entities are the main sources of law. So we consider national law and international law. And we have built this model of governance on the idea of political consent and accountability. But then we move nowadays to a triadic model of governance. Some people are talking about a pluralistic model of governance in terms of the very fact that each of these actors is as a sort of multiplied stage in its own. So we still have public actors like states or supranational entities, but then we deal with private actors in terms of owners of online platforms, services, infrastructures, and so on, internet service provider, the so-called big tech or GAFAM, and individuals that are no longer considered only as citizens, but mainly as end users and consumers. And in this model of governance, of course, the type of regulation have been multiplied. We do have bottom-up regulation, self-regulation, even forms of deregulation. And mainly, the idea is that public and private actors cooperate, creating forms of co-regulation. And we witness the rise of transnational law. Transnational law is an expression that has been created actually many years ago by Jessup in the 50s. But nowadays, it has become very much important, and it is the law that is created by big private actors. Okay, so the traditional way in which in Europe we look at the impact of ICT on law could be summarized by making reference to a normative framework. If you read many official documents, reports from expert group, European Commission, white papers, recommendation, and so on, all these documents frame regularly the issue of ICT in normative terms of opportunities and risk. Seems to be that according to the European Commission, this is the framework through which to look at the impact of digitization. And so there is always a list of opportunity in terms of efficiency, power of calculation, powers of prediction, and many others possible opportunities in terms of the increase of the digital single markets, the economic impact that the AI has nowadays, and that computation has, big data, data-driven economy, and so on. And of course, connected with these opportunities, there is a very large set of risks in terms of lack of control, lack of autonomy and self-determination, privacy and data protection, black box, discrimination, and so on. So as you can see, there is, as you know, the current risk approach to the question of regulation and governance. So the idea is that when we want to regulate our own information and data-driven society, we need to resort to a risk approach. So here is a point that brings me back to a paper that I read many years ago that has been published in 1985 by an American philosopher called James Moore that I had a chance to meet some years ago. And in this paper that was called "What is Computer Ethics?", James Moore remarked that with reference to technology, we need to pay attention to the type of question that we ask when we deal with technology, and how this question changes throughout the implementation and incorporation of technology within our own society. So my question is, what are the questions we ask according to a narrative based on a normative framework? So normally we ask two questions: how to take advantage of ICT, how to regulate ICT. The first question raises issues of technological innovation, economic development, and legal certainty, which underlies a specific idea of law. The second question raises issues of individual rights, collective security, and end-user trust, which underlies a different conception of law. Nowadays in Europe, at the level of the European Commission and institution, there is a sort of clash, dialectics, and possible contradiction between this different conception of law. So the normative framework is intended here to envisage and design a form of society influenced and shaped by ICT. And I do believe that this normative framework is should be not the only conceptual framework that we must use in order to understand the impact of ICT, because it limits our perspective and understanding of our own society. So nowadays, the political and economic race toward ICT has created a normative race toward ICT regulation. Nowadays, in the fields of law, we are always talking about how to regulate, what types of regulation, top-down regulation, co-regulation, bottom-up regulation. And we deal with new phenomenon that, if you want, we can talk a little bit after, that are technological normativity, that is to say, the idea that we can embody norms and values within the functioning of technological processes and devices. The privatization of the enforcement of law. The enforcement of law has been delegated to private actors, and the phenomenon of regulation by design. That is to say, that we want to design technological device and processing in such a way as to make them compliant by the beginning with legal expectations. So the race toward ICT regulation, according to me, risks to make us overlook one key factor, one main point. That is to say that we interact with digital models and systems. And so, to quote Feldman, the human and non-human participation in the construction of our own world. In my opinion, there is much more than the question of how to regulate some technological instruments. The idea is that we, human and non-human actors, we participate in the construction of our own world. So for this reason, in my book, I moved to consider the impact of ICT on society, and I talked about an everyday revolution of life, of our own life. And I remarked that there is a sort of convergence of this idea that the impact of ICT concern mainly our everyday life. For instance, there is also this idea in the Fourth Revolution by Luciano Floridi, in The Culture of AI by Anthony Elliott, and also in Everyday Chaos by David Weinberger, just to remain with some books that have been recently published on these topics, all taking the stance that digitization is really ingrained in our everyday life. So there is a very big impact of ICT on society, since almost every human activity nowadays takes place on digital platforms that mediates and organize the procurement of data-intensive goods and services. So here there is a very important point that may be easily overlooked, but it is very much important. Not only private actors try to make us to have access more and more to the market of data-intensive goods and services, but there is also the European Commission that says that we need to increase the demand for data-intensive goods and services if we want to create in Europe a digital single market. So data-intensive goods and services means that goods and services, everyday goods and services, are the more and more based on the processing of personal and non-personal data. They are data intensive. So its own value and its own functioning depends the more and the more on the capability of processing data. In that sense, they are data intensive. So if we move from a type of goods and services to another type of goods and services, we are not only changing our own market, we are also changing the society that is concerned with the procurement of this type of goods and services. Because data-intensive goods and services require the elaboration and delegation of decision and task to computational system that can process this automatically, this data-intensive aspect of goods and services. So here there is a very big change that is driven not only by private actors, but also by public actors, because public actors take into consideration, for instance, the Ursula von Leyen doctrine about the economic creation of the European digital single market. The idea is we need to be mimetic of private actors. If they have a very strong business model, we need to use our governance model in order to recreate the condition in Europe for the rise of this business model that is based on data-driven economy. So let me then go to the main aspect of my thesis. So here I can see the computational power in the book, largely not only in the specific computer science meaning, but more generally as the power to process inputs and produce outputs that feeds an ever-increasing number of AI models and systems. So here you can recognize from this definition the idea that the more and the more we are creating an algorithmic society where computational power is the power to process input and transform them into outputs. And this definition has been used recently to define AI in the proposal, in the European proposal for AI regulation. As you know, there are many different definitions of AI, and nowadays the European Commission resort to take into consideration this definition of AI because it is very close to the definition of computational power and algorithms. So this computational power throughout the AI models and system that it fits is deeply and ubiquitously ingrained in our forms of life. By form of life, without nowadays, I don't want to make necessarily reference to Wittgenstein, but just more generally, I mean the set of social practice that combine together and coordinate the syntactic and semantic rules that guide our everyday lives, our habits, practice, activities. Everyday activities are governed by rules, by norms that guide how we interact together and how we give meaning to our own reality and world. And of course, there is a very strong impact of computational power over the syntactical and semantic rules, because computational power affects directly syntactical rules. Computational systems, they are mainly based on syntactical rules. There is no time to discuss all the evolution of artificial intelligence, from symbolic AI to syntactical AI. Nowadays, machine learning systems are mainly based on statistical correlation and neural networks. So mainly they work with syntactical rules, but indirectly they also affect semantic rules, because for computational power, for computational system, the question is how to combine together the syntactical dimension that is entrusted to syntactical engine with the semantic dimension that is mainly reserved to this semantic engine that are human beings. So the more we resort to AI system operating through syntactical rules, the more we appeal to the need for meaning, because on the one hand, we are creating a world, a reality and the culture that the more and the more is depending on the functioning of computational systems that are based on syntactical rules. And so this makes it problematic, the fields of the question of meaning. The more an AI system has a high degree of autonomy, the more we pursue some meaningful human control. So let's take into consideration one point that is important. 15, 20 years ago, we were always talking about the economy and society of information. There were books, documents, and so on, all focusing on the idea of information. Since at least 5-10 years, even if we still make reference to the idea of information, nowadays we talk all the time about data. We talk about data-driven economy, data-driven society, big data, data analytics, data science, and so on. Why we move from the idea of information to the idea of data? Simply because information is normally understood in the theory of information as data plus meaning. So it requires human being to be processed at semantic level. But data can be processed syntactically by computational system without making necessarily recourse to human beings as semantic engine. So data-driven economy and society means an economy and a society that to some extent can make abstraction of the dimension of meaning. So, of course, that is a very big problem, as you can imagine, but behind the shift from information to data, and this focus on data means that computational system can process data in a syntactic way and can even accomplish some proto-semantical activities that allows them to take decision and work quite in an efficient way. And so that makes all the difference. Even if, of course, and we can come back to this, there are some strategies in computer science in order to recuperate this semantic dimension throughout strategies like human-based computation and some other strategies. So computational power increasingly and ubiquitously rearticulate the syntax and the semantic of a society. So it embodies norms into products, practice, devices, and computational system that structure our everyday forms of life. So it doesn't tell us what to do, like traditional forms of regulation, but it shapes how to live, how we live. The computational powers tend to transform, and here we are with the thesis of my book. Computational powers tend to transform and to adapt our environment, both the world and our own society, to the functioning of computational models and systems. That is to say, by creating a computed reality. If we want to delegate task and decision to computational system, and if we want to make them to properly operate and function, we need to progressively adapt our own reality, our world, our society, to their functioning, to the functioning of the computational models. Okay, of course, this the representation of reality of this computational system that is based on computational model is different from the way in which we understand and represent reality. So there is a big impact on ICT on knowledge because the functioning of computational system that is based on computational models, it changes the way in which this system understand and represent the reality. So I suggest to endorse an epistemological framework that concerns how we represent and make experience of the reality, and this we is both us and artificial agents. So here we are with the impact of ICT on knowledge. Of course, we do know that we represent and experience the reality. We always do this throughout mediations, categories, schemes, models, points of view, levels of abstraction. Whatever is your own epistemology, we always have a mediated relationship with the reality. And we also know that mediation are not necessarily only inbuilt properties of human beings, like, for instance, just to make a name to Kantian epistemology, but mediation can be constructed technologically by technology. There is the idea of, by Clark and Chams, of the extended mind, but even without going so far, we have mediations as inbuilt properties of human cognitivity, but also we develop mediation, and even we constructed mediation. So here there is the epistemological framework of ICT that takes into consideration that we are epistemic subjects according to three different meanings or scaling capabilities. First of all, we can take that we human beings, we can take decision and act within the world based on our representation of the reality. Of course, this representation of the reality changes throughout time. There are many different ideas and conception of epistemology, but at the very first level, we take decision and act based on our representation of the reality. But then we can build mediation technologies that are between us and the world and mediate our representation of the reality. We have always constructed technologies, instruments that mediate between us and the world, like a spreadsheet or a blackboard or my glasses or whatever you want, that mediate between us and the reality. Nowadays, we can build technologies, computational systems that take decision and act based on their own representation of the reality, based on computational models. And don't forget, we cannot consider that since it is us that we create these technologies, these computational models, that everything is under control. Because of course, when this computational system take decision and act based on their own representation of the reality, there can always be something that escapes from our own control and that is irreducible to the way in which we traditionally consider and understand some aspects of our own reality from our own different epistemic points of view. So I say there is a big conceptual jump to do, because we delegate an increasing number of decisions and tasks to computational systems that operate based on their own representation of reality that is different from and sometimes irreducible to ours. The very fact that we are capable of constructing these computational models should be not too much reassuring. First of all, because technically nowadays computational system, machine learning system can learn by themselves even more quickly than they can learn from what has been elaborated by human beings. So they can develop themselves. This is the idea of autonomy as capability of changing their internal states, even from a computational point of view in terms of their own models of representation of reality. So the way in which, from a legal point of view, I represent the taking of a decision or the enforcement of a task could be, from an epistemological point of view, very different and always and sometimes irreducible to the way in which a computational system take a decision and perform a task based on its own representation of reality. Okay, so there are three main conceptual shifts. One, I have already recalled, it is from artificial intelligence to artificial agency. That means that AI systems are mostly characterized by their ability to act. From artificial agents to epistemic subject, it is the specific agency that requires specific cognitive models that are no longer or not necessarily based on human intelligence, understanding, and representation. And we move from a limited number of agents and viewpoints to an increased proliferation of new artificial agents and viewpoints. Of course, this can also have some positive consequences, since it entails an epistemic richness that provides us with new perspective about ourselves and the world. So there is also a positive side. So sometimes it is, in that respect, sometimes the analogy with human intelligence and anthropocentrism prevents us from seeing also the epistemic richness, as well as the real set of opportunities and risks that are produced by AI models and systems. So there are new questions that we ask according to the narrative based on an epistemological framework. This new question is, how much will ICT change our everyday life? How to interact with ICT models and systems? The first question raises ontological and epistemological issues about the perception of our everyday life. And the second question raises normative issues about how human and non-human participate in the construction of the same world. So the epistemological framework is intended to envisage and design, that is to say, to understand how our form of life is shaped and influenced by ICT. Okay, so here is the conclusion. The conclusion is very simple, is that all conceptual shifts are at the basis of my book. So if you are interested more in this conceptual shift, you can read the book. No, I'm joking. Thank you very much for your attention. That was the main idea of the book. Okay, I can stop the.
Thank you very much, Massimo.
Share the screen.
Thank you for your deep and also broad talk. Let me introduce Sanja Bojanic, the director of CAS. Sanja, maybe would you like to say something?
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Massimo, for your talk. I appreciate it very much. Well, you are like inviting me to speak, Gabriele, now, but maybe others have other input that is better than mine.
Okay. Maybe are there some questions from fellows?
Yeah. No, it's because I didn't get online before the starting of the lecture because I had my teaching ending. So I came late.
Okay. Maybe I can start with the first question, Massimo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to ask for more information about the triadic model of governance. Okay. In particular about the role and also I think the power of online platforms. Because for instance, the European privacy regulation was created with this middle out approach. And but I think that there is the risk with this method of giving too much power to the lobbies, for example, to online platforms. What do you think about this problem? And how did work middle out approach in the case of European privacy regulation?
Yeah, Gabriele, you are right. It is very difficult to understand how to deal with this subject because they are not little actors; they are very big actors. Their balance, the richness that they have is superior to nation states. So it is very difficult to deal with them from very different points of view, and sometimes, even when we try to regulate them, both at the level of regulation or even at the level of judicial adjudication, we took decision in Europe that they end up reinforcing their dominant position instead of containing their position. So the problem is that when you have a dyadic relationship, you can, to some extent, try to understand what could be the side effects of your own decision. But as far as you introduce them in this specific position as owner of digital platforms, they do not produce content. They invite us to produce content, but they take advantage from the content that we produce. There are many new relationships that we create, from state to private actors, from private actors to individuals as users, and vice versa. So one first point is, do they have a governance model? And my specific answer is no. They don't have a governance model. They have a business model. And they use their business model as a kind of governance model. They take decision and they try to fulfill expectation, both from the top and from the bottom, only to the extent to which the fulfillment of this social expectation, they do not put into crisis their business model. So they can take different decisions in US, in Africa, or in Europe, according to their feeling to what is best for them, in order not to put into any doubt or crisis their business model. That is very effective because they earn so much. They have a dominant position. In US are even more afraid of this dominant position that we are in Europe. There is no research on the internet that we do unless throughout Google. 95% or search on internet is made through Google, and the remaining 5% is just because we remember some sites, some names, so we don't have to search with Google. And of course, in the book, for instance, I dedicate one chapter to the question of the right to be forgotten. That is an example of how the European Court of Justice, even if it was motivated by the idea to sanction Google and to make Google responsible for the right to be forgotten, it ended up with reinforcing the dominant position of Google. Because if you entrust the enforcement of a fundamental right concerning memory and oblivion, we are here between philosopher and humanist, and we do understand how memory is important for the construction of individual and collective identity. We end off the delimitation of memory and oblivion to a private society from California. And so they decide what we remember and what we can forget by enforcing this right to forgotten. And remember that I asked to people, friends of mine that were working as a lawyer in Google, and they told me, even if this data is not official, they produce a report every year, but they do not include all the data, of course. And I hope that we are registering what I'm saying. And only 3% of the refusal of the right to be forgotten has been brought before a national authority, a national supervisory, or a national judge. The 3% of the refusal is a very small amount. It means that 97% of the cases has been managed by Google. Okay, so it means that we completely ended off the enforcement on a very important right to Google. And what is more, in the book, I remark a passage of one of the reports made by Google, where Google says, okay, we receive all the demand for the listing. And when you make a demand for the listing, you insert in the demand many personal data. So they take all this personal data. They have a very big data set. They can keep it for legal reasons. They map, they say in the report that they map the relationship between this data, and they create knowledge from this. They extract knowledge from this that they cannot share with all of us for privacy reasons. That is very fun enough, that for privacy reasons, they create knowledge, they make use of this knowledge, but they cannot share with us for privacy reasons. That is genial. So to come back to your questions, it's very difficult nowadays how to deal with this. I can give you another example. I have a very good friend of mine, was a former student, law students, that nowadays is directing the law office in the Banca d'Italia for the supervisory of the when you give credits. Okay, and so Amazon is very much interested in giving credit to people, because if you want to control the whole value chain of selling, of trading, you also need to control who gives money to people in order to allow them to buy something. So Amazon is very much interested in the allowance of credit. It doesn't want to do in itself, and to some extent it cannot, but it has created a platform for some private society that give credit. So there in the Banca d'Italia, they were committed to discuss with them the design of the interface in order to tell them you need to be transparent enough to make people understanding that they are dealing with private society in your own platform. And they had a very difficult time to make them to do something. This guy is a lawyer, is the head of an office at the Banca d'Italia, and he had a very big struggle just to discuss with them.
Very, very interesting. I agree with you, but the power of Amazon and Google is quite impressive. And are there other questions?
Please.
Marco Luca, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thank you very much, Massimo. It's a great talk and a very very rich subject. So there are sort of enormous amount of questions, of possible questions. But I will just sort of maybe focus on like, do you think that there are some already sort of being developed, some kind of regulations or practices within legal structures which would sort of respond to the challenges that you present in the book? Are there some kind of examples of this, of some good developments in this sense?
Okay, so let me take this question is the question nowadays in Europe, and if I had the answer, I would be at the place of Ursula von Leyen and so on. So I guess no one has the answer to this, but I want to answer to you because there is Europe is a sort of dialectics, perennial dialectics, is the attempt to combine together the opposite. So in Europe, we have this idea, very economical, from a very economic point of view, that we need to create the digital single market, that we need to struggle with US and China for digitization. We call this AI, but of course, artificial intelligence doesn't mean anything. It's a shortcut for digitization. So on the one hand, there is this idea, and the underlying idea of law behind this idea, it is that law is not to protect people. Law is directed to create a framework of legal certainty that is necessary for technological developments and economic innovation. Okay, so it is the idea we need to create a framework of certainty where we can develop the digital single market. Of course, we cannot abandon the other idea of law, that is, law is directed to protect people and to enforce human rights, fundamental rights, and regulation. So we need to not lose sight of the fact that data-intensive goods and services brings many problems and risks along. So we want to regulate this. It is not difficult. It is not easy to combine these two different ideas. So it is a very hard work for the European Commission. So the question is, we should try to regulate the technological convergence, but nowadays we opt out for regulating every different aspect of this technological convergence. So we have a regulation on personal data, a regulation on non-personal data, a data governance act, a digital service act, a proposal for AI regulation. I have been called by the Minister of External Affairs in Italy to work with them about the hypothesis of a convention on from the Council of Europe on AI. So there could be also conventions on AI at European level. So it will be difficult at the end of the day to create an harmonized legal framework when you have such different instruments. And of course, there are very technical aspects of this. Just to give you one example, in the GDPR, there is the idea of high risk processing of personal data. It is not defined by the GDPR, but that's been defined by the article group 1929. In the AI proposal, in the proposal of regulation of AI, there is high risk, the high risk approach, but the definition of high risk is different from the definition of high risk in the GDPR. But at the end of the day, you can have AI system that process personal data. So will you apply the GDPR to them, or will you apply the AI proposal for regulation? And of course, if you are a society in Europe that is developing AI systems, you don't have this legal certainty that you require in order to develop. So still in Europe, very often we resort to cloud computing system, HP system, or applications from abroad, because it is easy to rely on them instead of creating our own cloud computing infrastructure or to rely on our own applications. So it is very complicated, but the middle out approach that Gabriele was mentioning before, the idea of regulations that applies directly to all states, the Brussels effect in terms of we create a regulation, we protect people, and we want to have this in with extraterritorial scope that applies to everybody, could be a strategy, but it is quite early. The problem for me is strange enough, but as a legal scholars, my idea is we do not have to look only to the legal norms. We need to look to the social effects that structures our forms of life, the way in which we live. Because when the European Commission says we need to increment the demand for data-intensive goods and services, is saying we want to play the same role of this big tech, but we are public institutions. We are member states member. So it is difficult to develop the same business model.
Thank you. Other questions?
I have a question.
Please.
Hi, Federica. How are you?
Ciao, Massimo.
Ciao.
I'm fine. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm not much into this argument, but I was just thinking, what do you think of this from an ethical perspective? What do you think about this?
Thank you. That's a very big problem, Federica. And as I told at the very beginning, the way in which AI system, computational system work is challenging from a normative point of view. Our way in which we develop values, we apply values and norms. There are many ethical problems. Let me just mention a couple of them. One problem is when you resort to automated system, you curtail the sphere of human reflexivity. Because, for instance, even in the legal field, when you go before a judge, the judge is a third before the parties. And so the idea of a third before the parties is the idea that society is based on human conflict, social conflicts, and even democracy is based on competition between different values and interests. And so there must be figure institutional fora where we discuss and reflect over how to combine and balance different interests and values. So that's the essence of pluralism. But if you delegate a decision to an automated system that enforces just one of the interests at stake, there is no more any reflexivity, no more possibility to balance competing interests. There is just what has been called the normativity of AI. The normativity of AI is a very technical definition that means that when you construct the machine learning system, you need to attach a specific target to optimize the functioning of the machine learning system. So the machine learning system is optimized toward a target, toward a goal. This goal is measured throughout a quantitative standard that allows the people using the machine learning system to say how efficient the system is in reaching the target, the goal for which the system has been optimized. So at the end of the day, you don't have any balancing of different interests. And on the contrary, you have a system that is quantitatively measured in its capability of achieving a specific goal. If this goal is, so to speak, appreciated largely in a state by a majority, then it becomes the only social goal that is pursued. In US, you delegate some decision about penalties to softwares in terms of crime prevention. If you are in a state where people like very much, or politicians like very much, crime prevention, you can delegate to machine learning system the task to prevent crimes. If at the end of the year there is the rate of crimes has lowered down, you can show to everybody that your system is functioning very well according to this social goal. But maybe you accomplish this goal at the detriment of some other due process rights of people that have been discriminated by the functioning of the algorithm underlying this machine learning system. So, of course, there can be, from an ethical point of view, that there can be many problems. This is just one of the problems, but we could talk every day about autonomy, self-determination, transparency, and so on. Let me say just one more thing. Traditionally, we try to explain our own world and to construct our own society based on the explanation of our own world. Nowadays, we can construct devices that shapes our own world based on their own representation. And at the end of the day, after they take decision and act, we are even in the situation in which we cannot explain why these devices took that decision. So if in the legal field there is a debate about the right to explanation, it is because socially we have constructed system that can take decision that we are no longer able to explain ex post. So that could be, of course, another legal and ethical problem.
Yeah, thank you very much, Massimo.
Thank you to you, Federica. We share with Federica some interest in moral philosophy.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe if there are no other questions.
Victor raised his hand.
Victor, okay.
Thank you, Massimo. This has been most enlightening and most troubling in a very good sense, I think, because it raises so many important questions that you just told us. And I was wondering why I was listening to your talk that you've been often referring to giants such as Amazon and Google of the corporate world, and giants of state actors such as the European Union, China, United States. Yeah. And I was wondering, what do you think? What is your opinion? How the individual can make an impact in this discourse? How an individual can raise its voice and somehow aim to modify the outcome of these very complex and very difficult to understand discussions that you have been mentioning.
Thank you very much, Victor, for this question. That brings me back to the last chapter of my book. And when trying to answering to this question in the last chapter, I resort to a book that I read many years ago there was a book by Albert Ishman that is Voice, Loyalty, and Exit. It has been written in 1970. And so before Google, for instance, we do not have the possibility of exit. There is no other search engine in Europe. And there is no real possibility to make our voice to be heard. So we are out of the scheme designed by Hirschman, and that is very troublesome. So it is difficult for me to see what could be the role for individuals. And I don't believe the idea of radical exit by Jaron Lanier or all the other people say we have just to get out from the social networks. I was talking to young scholars from a secondary school in Torino yesterday, and none of them is on Facebook, all of them is on Instagram. So if you get out from one social network to enter in another social network that belongs to the same people, I don't see how getting out from here to go there doesn't make any difference. So the question is whether there can be a collective action, because individuals are targeted as consumers in the internet. And even the more and the more, there is a big strategy to extend the notion of consumer to young people. So my niece of 8 years old is already targeted as a consumer in the net, because she has access to a smartphone. Even if she doesn't have a smartphone, she has access to a smartphone. And she uses the smartphone not only as a user, but already as a consumer. It's always difficult to prevent them from downloading applications or buying something. So it is difficult for individual, because it is difficult nowadays to create a joint commitment in terms of a public action. So that would be the topic of a next paper that I want to write. But my idea is that there is a sort of microphysics of powers. That is to say, these big giants, they give us micro powers, not big powers, micro powers. The power to publish a selfie, the power to say something, the power to do many micro activities. All these micro powers are all concerned with the publication and dissemination of data, and we are no longer in the position to aggregate this data and to transform them into a public commitment or action. So we are individuals that have no standing as a collectivity online. 15 years ago, at the time of some books on this, there was the idea that maybe individuals could have been empowered, and so politically could have been a stronger role thanks to the online and so on. Nowadays, we are a bit more suspicious about that, and we have here an expert on this, that is Gabriele, on this topic. And it is very difficult for me to see how individuals can connect together in order to have a public committed voice toward. On the other hand, very often this digital platform can be used to predict people and to manipulate people. Don't forget that Twitter has obfuscated Trump's personal accounts when they were sure that Biden was going to win. So from the point of view of Twitter, the problem was not hate speech or free speech or whatever. The problem is that they have powerful algorithms to predict who is going to win. At the very precise moment where they knew that Biden was going to win, they decided to obfuscate Trump. Okay, because they want to meet people's expectation. Okay, they want, if this is consistent with the upturn of the president. Okay, of course, there were also, according to me, there were sound legal reasons for obfuscating Trump accounts, and different from the idea of freedom of speech and so on. That would be very technical. But anyway, it is difficult for me to see how individuals, of course, we can say that the individual have more access to information. We can say that the individuals can be more aware. But I'm not sure that individuals nowadays, they have the capability to commit themselves together and to create a joint action. Of course, it is absolutely fundamental that we keep institutional fora where we can discuss and deliberate about political and social values.
Thank you.
And just a small question.
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe this sort of that there is an economic question as well in terms of sort of market dominance, that once you break up the big actors in the field, you, of course, you don't solve all the problems and so forth, but that some problems are already, that you address something in some sort of, effective way. Do you believe that this would?
Yeah, of course, that's the problem. The problem is how to deal with the dominant position of these big giants. And of course, we need to understand what to do. There can be many different strategies to make them to pay taxes, to regulate them, to break their power, to limit the dominant position, to deal with the consequences of the way in which they structure the market, to elaborate regulations that takes into account competition. And there are many technical points that are so specific. If you want, I can give you an example. This is very technical, but just to give you an example. There is an ongoing practice that is going to be developed in the next future, that is price discrimination. Price discrimination is the idea that we can differentiate the price of a good or service according to the people that is going to buy the good or service. Offline, we cannot do this because we feel unreasonable that the same thing or service is sold to me and to Federica at a different price. We accept this only when we can recognize the rationale behind the differentiation. If I go to the cinema with my mother, who is an old lady, I can easily accept that she will pay a reduced price of the ticket because it is an incentive for my mother to go out from home and to go to the cinema. So I can easily recognize the rationale behind. That is important because the reconstruction of the differentiation of price is based on a causal explanation in terms of cause and effects. But if you discriminate price based on statistical correlation that says that I am a type of buyer and Federica is another type of buyer, there is no rationale behind this unless what is called the economic surplus of the consumer, that is to say the possibility to consider the difference between the price at which a good is sold and the price at which I am available to buy this good. So the idea is, it is preferable to sell something to me at 10 euro and to sell the same thing to Federica at 9 euro, because we don't lose 1 euro, we gain 9 euro. But of course, that's create an unfair competition because of the capability of some sellers to process statistically it create our own profiles, and also it creates a reasonable differentiation between me and Federica. I'm happy with Federica, but I'm not happy with myself paying more than she pays. And all of these could be done online without me and other people even being aware of the price differentiation. So, and we could apply this reasoning of statistical correlation to many different situations. So nowadays there is a very sophisticated enterprise in computer science, guided by some scholars like, for instance, Judea Pearl, that tries to understand whether we can create mechanisms to explain statistical correlation in causal terms. Which of course it is not simple, but at least it could give us a counterfactual explanation of how to deal with these decisions that are guided by statistical correlations. So, and of course, thanks to the legal field where we used to explain everything in causal terms, it is not so easy to be confronted with statistical correlation only.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. There are many strategies where we deal with this problem of how to combine together again syntactical dimension and semantic dimension. But the most interesting strategies are adopted by a society that want to take advantage of the human semantic capabilities. I'm always telling to my students that Instagram has been created for a purpose. And the purpose is to have an incredible number of people that on a daily basis tag photos and so train machine learning system to recognize images that is necessary if you want to have driverless car. So we are all working for them on a daily basis.
Yeah, just on this point, sort of the idea of I mean, it has several names, but it's sort of data dividend or a sort of data union, which would in sort of create, since we are data producers in this sense, and not only data from our, as you say, not only from our personal data, but also on in sort of categorizing and creating sort of categories and training machine sort of learning systems. So in this sense that we deserve some kind of payment in, I mean, not only payment, but maybe also where some discretion on for what our data is being used and so forth. And not only personal, but social data in the sense of my data is nothing unless we all contribute data and so forth. So also this data dividend moment would also sort of is.
Yeah, that could be a strategy. Of course, there is a couple of problems with it, not problem, but difficulties with this. One difficulty is that at the individual level, our own data are not very valuable. So data are valuable when they are aggregated and when you have specific targets in order to process them and to extract economic value from large quantity of data. So you need to have computational power, HPC infrastructure, specific target, create profiles and apply to specific markets. So it is not so easy to states. Normally they have so big quantity, big collection of data since many centuries. They do not do anything with all this data. So it is not so easy to extract economic value from data. So this big giant says, we already give you access to services for free. What do you want more? But the other real problem is that we could make them pay dividend, or we could negotiate with them at the level of states, like for instance in Australia. But you need to have political decisions in this section. And so there is a very big lobbying in US or even in Europe. So you never know what is the real will to negotiate with them and your real power to negotiate with them. They, of course, they're always menacing to get out from here, to remove, to change or whatever. The real reality is that there is a new perception of what is capitalism, a capital, and when you are Facebook and you have 2 billion of people in your own community, you can consider this as a capital, not in terms of resources, but in terms of needs. Because you can say, okay, let me say how many people, for instance, I give you an example, how many people in my own community do not have a bank account? And you discover that 2 million of people in Facebook do not have a bank account. So let me provide them with a system of payment for people that are unbanked. So I'm giving them for free a service. They will be paid me back with credit data. And I even giving a social service. And it is a real problem because 2 million of people in the world do not have a bank account, and they want to have a system of payments. So they can, looking at their own community, they can discover that there are resources and needs that they can accommodate, and so they can extract information and data from this, and so they can repurpose your model and applying this model to different sectors or markets. So the question is about the model. Is the data-driven business model. And so far, the idea of Europe is we need to take a part of this. We need to have a stake of this. But of course, we need to, it's incredible that Amazon doesn't pay taxes during the pandemics. That's just a shame. Of course, you need to be able to be careful to the fact that Amazon will not be put in the position to pass the cost of taxes on individuals and consumers, so to shift the burden of the cost. But you need to take some decision. You need to do. We need to do something, because otherwise, it's just intolerable. Everybody has been impoverished by the pandemics, except for Bezos. It's a little bit striking.
Yeah, I agree with you, Massimo. Okay, the debate has been very rich, and I would like to thank everybody for the participation, Massimo Durante for the interesting talk, and of course Sanja Bojanic and CAS for the opportunity. And so if there are no other questions, I say have a nice day and see you soon, I hope.
And thank you very much for the possibility. It was a pleasure and an honor to be here and to discuss with all of you. Thank you very much,
Massimo.
Thank you.
We look forward to see you in Rijeka and to welcome you in Tres Island.
Hopefully. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
See you. Bye.